Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to the first event in the How I Write series, a series in which the Writing Center presents 2 or 3 panelists, and it's a series intended to share community members' thoughts and experiences with writing. My name is Reid, I'm a senior at Williams and one of the coordinators at the writing workshop, and I'll be moderating our discussion. I'm honored to introduce Professors Rhie and Jeffrey Israel as our panelists tonight. Professor Rhie is chair of the English department and last year's recipient of the Nelson Bushnell Prize for Teaching and Writing at Williams. Professor Israel is chair of the religion department, and his critically acclaimed book, Living with Hate in American Politics and Religion, was published not too long ago in 2019. We are very grateful and excited to have with us 2 professors who are known across campus for their deep commitment to student success and teaching. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly acknowledge that, in one sense, the How I Write series is rather strange. You wouldn't expect to see an equivalent series on how I talk or how I walk, for example. Writing is a form of thinking and expression that we all participate in at Williams, whether in essays, lab reports, emails, or applications, to the point where it may seem odd to dedicate an entire series of discussions to something so ubiquitous. Although it is true that writing is something that we all share, writing is also, as I'm sure we can all relate, an intimately personal, sometimes frustratingly personal activity. Thus, it is our hope, and here I speak for the Writing Center at large, that our panelists and audience alike may find something interesting, unexpected, and fruitful in this ever so familiar topic by listening, pondering, and discussing the question of how each of us writes. To this end, we will have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session after the panel. Thank you once again for attending, and with that said, let us begin the actual event. So the format is very loose and informal. To inspire conversation, I'll begin with one open-ended question, and Professor Rhie and Israel, please feel free to respond to one another and take the conversation in whatever direction you think is most interesting. Here's the question, and feel free to introduce yourselves further if you'd like to with this question. How has your experience or conception of writing changed since you were a student? Professor Israel, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. You have to let me think for a second here. I don't want to just blurt this out. How was my thinking about writing, did you say?
Or experience.
Experience of
or
writing.
Anything you'd like about writing.
Yeah. I guess the first thing that occurs to me, and thank you, Reid, by the way, for asking me to do this and for organizing this and for that lovely introduction. I wish I could say that now I never feel rushed, like I'm just cobbling to get things together in ways that I'd rather not have to because I feel under pressure. Unfortunately, that's not always been the case since I was a student. I think one thing that has been felt lamentable is that there are times where the pressures of life make it so that some kind of vision that I have of writing that's more unconstrained isn't always possible. But I do think that I have, over time, had so many experiences with my own self-destructive behaviors in writing, the little tricks that my mind plays on me and little moments of discouragement with myself and the feeling of disorientation or vertigo that I get with an idea. When that starts to emerge, I think as a student, and especially as a graduate student, that just felt so overwhelming sometimes and really inhibiting. And because I've experienced that so often at this point, I've come to recognize those kind of tics or those moves that my mind makes against me, so that I'm ready for them and I'm ready to kind of meet them and greet them and say, oh yeah, here is, Jeff has no idea what he's talking about and doesn't know how to put a sentence together. I love you, I've known you for so long, right? And now, but let's, spend a little time together and then move on and try to keep the flow going. So I think recognizing my various tendencies to get in my own way, the specific ones that I have that are part of my writing process, recognizing that is a big difference, and I guess a kind of maturation, not that it's over, but it is certainly something that I feel a little more comfortable with now. I don't know if you have that feeling.
Yeah. No, I'm familiar with that. I mean, before I offer my own response, I feel like, there's this feeling that I've had, and I think other people have had, which is like, just because you've written something well once doesn't mean that the next time it's going to work. Mm-hmm. Every single time feels a little bit like, you don't know if it's going to work. And it's an interesting thing about writing, every time you write something that you're happy with, that you feel that really, says something you want to say in the way that you want to say it, you feel lucky. Like, wow, how did that come off? And it's interesting because I don't think many other tasks that we get good at do we feel that way. There's something very peculiar about writing. Actually, I think to answer your question, Reid, I'm sort of moved to go back to the time when I fell in love with writing. And then to kind of wonder, like, what happened that made writing feel so fraught, I was lucky to have a seventh grade English teacher who, just cared about us and was very open-minded and asked us to play with metaphor in our writing, just to describe things. Anything that we wanted, but to kind of lard our papers with metaphors. And maybe that's not exactly the way he put it, but that's the way I took his instructions. And I kind of ran with it. I would try to cram these 1 or 2 page descriptions of like a car or a game or something like this with metaphors. And I think there was something amazing about feeling the way that, both metaphor and simile, but I think especially metaphor, they connect things that are different and illuminate new things about things you're familiar with by doing that. That made language seem incredibly alive to me, and it seemed fun. It was like the farther afield the metaphors went, the more fun it was. The kind of like, how far could you go and could it still work? When did it become cheesy? Though I don't think I really thought in those terms then. It was just everything was possible. There was never this like, oh, that's lame, or that's like, everything was cool. And up until that point, I really hated English. English is not my first language. And I think it took me a long time to even realize it was called English. I thought it was just called American, for a long time. And I think I embarrassed myself in front of a teacher saying, oh yeah, I like American, And so it took me like till 7th grade to feel like at home reading and writing in the language. And then it came alive. But then something happened. I think it was in early high school where I lost a sense of this was a playful field, and it became something I did for the expectations of others in order to get a certain kind of approval. And I think that was really the beginning of a pretty difficult stretch for me, where the thing was like I was skillful. I could write in ways that did get approval, but it felt so much like I was performing. Like that connection between myself and language making was in some way ruptured. And so I still had the technical ability to write in ways that would get good grades and good comments and all that. But it started to feel, I felt more and more alienated from everything I was saying. Like it was just a task that I had. And it became more and more tense because the less I saw myself in my writing, the less meaning I got of any writing I did, and the more it became simply about the external validation that I did or didn't get. And so I think that was part of the that was symptomatic, I think, of a real kind of alienation from school in general. And as some of you in the room know, like I actually didn't manage to graduate from high school. I think, and actually the things that really, I remember the last 2 things I couldn't finish, I was just so blocked trying to do were a paper on Faulkner's The Bear, long short story, and Conrad's Heart of Darkness. you know, and I just stared at the blank screen for like days and days and maybe even weeks and felt like I couldn't think of what to say. And I think it's because like that well had gone dry, you know. And then it wasn't until, okay, so that was like when I was 16 or 17 when I dropped out of high school. I didn't go back to school till I was 22. And I'd spent 3 years at a Buddhist temple in the meantime, not doing much reading or writing at all, but meditating a lot. And I think that actually got me back in touch with the playful side of thinking and reading and writing, where when I started at the junior college I went to, the English classes were the places that it's what I enjoyed the most, and I had sort of reconnected with that kind of like, oh my gosh, you can just, you know, of course you're writing an essay, but in a way you're also telling a story about this thing that matters, you know. And so I could observe the conventions of a academic essay, but feel like I was saying something I really want to say, and have fun with the form of it, you know. Yeah, and so I think that's that kind of dialectic that I think I've moved between ever since. That sense of sometimes I feel like I'm really, like the language I'm writing is conveying something that I identify with, that I see myself in. It's not always personal expression. I don't think that's the issue. It's not like, because it's not always personal, but even when it's not, it still feels like I see myself in what I want to say. And I'm saying it because I want to say it, rather than I'm managing to write this because someone else expects me to finish this task. And I have to say that it's been an oscillation between those two kind of poles through grad school and even through my early career at Williams, you know. And so when I teach writing, I think the thing I try most to do is to invite students to reconnect with the part of themselves that actually enjoys language, that isn't writing papers because a teacher expects it of them. And it's hard, because I think I see that a lot of students have fallen into the same pattern I did, you know, where I even actually, there's this funny story that last year during COVID, I was walking down by Cole Field, and I think there was a first-year student who was on the phone with a parent. It sounded like just, you know, I caught like half a minute of a conversation, you know. And the student was saying to, you know, his mom or dad, it's like, you know, I know how to write a paper to get an A, and it's really hard not to do that. You know, really hard to actually write what I think I want to write, because it's just so tempting to fall back into the habits that allow me to get a successful grade. And clearly he was saying in a tone where he was kind of ruining this. He was sort of bemoaning the fact that he was limiting his own capacity by doing this. And so, yeah, I think it's not uncommon. But I think the beautiful thing is, like, I think more and more now, to get back to where Jeff started us, it's like, I can feel that pull into like losing myself, you know. I know what it feels like. It feels tight, it feels dry, and so even more than writer's block, I think that's actually the thing that I look out for. Because there are tricks to get over writer's block, but this is the kind of existential attitude towards writing that's even more corrosive, I think. Because you can write a lot in that spirit of just doing what the discipline or your colleagues or someone else wants of you, and yet you can lose your way very badly doing that. So, not even quite sure if that answered your question, but anyway, yeah. So, yeah.
I'm very interested in this feeling of alienation in writing. It's something that very much resonates with me, that other of writing, whether it's the other Professor Israel, who you've come to know over the years, or the other of the teacher, the reader, the external judge, that can feel like it makes writing less fun and less playful. I'm wondering if there's a counterpart, if in other ways you involve other readers in your process of writing, to what extent you collaborate in your writing with other people, and how you involve, you know, other writers in your own writing.
Do you want to take this?
Sure. So this is what I'm thinking here. I haven't really done I almost did actually a co-written project, and I did some work on that once, but it's not really been a thing that I've developed fully. And maybe relatedly, I do find that my writing, at least the book project that you mentioned, my first book, Living with Hate in American Politics and Religion, it did have a kind of conversational style, even though it had a lot of philosophical argumentation and also interpretation of popular culture and literature and so forth. I wanted it to communicate something in a way that felt like I was, and I actually say this in the introduction, that was modeled on a good long conversation. Like the kind of conversation you have with a friend that lasts over years and years, like those ongoing disagreements that you have, that you come back to over and over again, where you say, well, you always make that move, and then they say, well, you always delegitimize it with this, and, right? And you just keep doing it because there's a kind of real relationship there. And I think that was a model for that book, and in the project that I'm working on now, I feel, and this was also true in that book, that relationships that I have with friends, intellectual relationships also with colleagues, they make a big imprint on where my thinking is and what I ultimately find are the salient connections. And I think, also related to your first question, one of the things that has changed for me is I feel very deep confidence, I have to say, in the validity of that as a kind of methodology. Right, that to a certain extent, the framing, the cutting off of what's appropriate to address in this material is always somewhat arbitrary, and it's very complicated in how to justify it, and there are lots of different ways to justify it. And I've come to feel very strongly about the merit of allowing that to be shaped through living conversations, arguments, passions that are relational. So that certain ongoing arguments that I have in my life and friends that I have who I'm always sort of nurturing ideas with, they are very present to me as those kinds of productive others, I think. And there's a way in which that makes the work very contingent to a moment in time and me and my relationships and the way I talk and what I care about and what the people around me happen to care about, and the random people who show up on campus and the students, right? It all ends up being deeply contingent, but I've ultimately decided that that is actually a real benefit to the intellectual work that's going on in the material and to the writing, because what I'm constantly trying to do is, am I communicating well here, right? Is it going to be possible for somebody to connect? And connect either negatively, which is good, right? Passionately disagreeing with me, or connect positively. Am I giving them enough of myself and what I'm trying to express to connect? And so I think that connecting with others becomes a medium through which to gauge whether or not that's happening in my writing.
Reid, I'm really glad you asked this question because it actually gives me an opportunity to follow up in a way that it's important to me. But I think what I said earlier, I could imagine someone taking that as my suggesting that one shouldn't think about an audience when writing, but actually that's not at all true. I think all communication, writing is for another. It's not just self-expression. Even when we want to express ourselves, it's because we want someone to hear us, right? And so when I said, not writing for external validation, I think what I'm meaning is it's more like this very impersonal, like the teacher, or like the discipline, or just like some, you don't even know who it is, just writing for someone else, but it's not for you. And in fact, I think like I feel most alive, both when I'm speaking and when I'm writing, when I have a very vivid sense of who I'm trying to connect with. you know. And so it definitely jives with what Jeff was just saying. And I think the real key is sort of like having a relationship with that audience of some kind. I think actually it might be why, like, you know, we often write better for teachers who we care about. Like, we really, you know, sometimes it can be scary because we maybe want to impress them and all these things, so it can get a little fraught, like it always can with authority and people who have the power to grade you and all that. But if you really have a deep sort of intellectual relationship with a mentor or teacher, then I think the writing can feel more alive just because of that, you know. And so I like to write in a pretty explicitly conversational way. In fact, like the introduction to a collection of essays that I put together on Cavell, Stanley Cavell, a philosopher, was actually, is just a compilation of emails that I sent back and forth with my co-editor. Like, we just started talking, you know, emailing each other about, like, well, you know, what mattered to us about this project. And we realized that we had in the emails themselves the draft of the introduction for the book. And so, and I think because it was this kind of like, you know, personal back and forth, even though in the finished product, it's just one voice. It's not as if it's like staged as a dialogue, but it has this life to it, you know. And so yes. And also, I'll just end with this kind of like philosophy, you know, nerd moment, you know. In Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, in the chapter on narrativity, he actually talks about how weird it is that philosophers often think about language as based on propositions, you know, and they take certain kinds of sentences like the cat is on the mat as like basic elements of language, when actually in truth, language is always dialogic. You know, the most basic form of language is probably question and answer, you know, and so, so I think it goes really deep. So yeah, anyway, I'll pause there.
Professor Rhie, you mentioned the high potentials of a teacher, or thinking about a teacher in writing. I was wondering if you could kind of expound upon your own pedagogy on writing, if there's anything challenging about teaching writing, anything especially fun, or either.
Okay. My first goal is to do no harm. And you know, it's funny, but it's also like really serious. Like, you know, one bad response from a teacher can freeze a student for a long time, you know. And so I would rather, yeah. So okay. So that takes a lot of different forms. I'm not going to just cash it out into certain concrete examples yet, but. And then what I try to do that's in keeping with what I've been saying so far is awaken a sense of voice in students, and also a sense of the appreciation of audience. So in some classes, I even encourage students to write their first essay in letter form. They're actually writing a piece about something intellectual, something we've read, something we've studied. So it has that kind of analytic or interpretive element to it, but actually asking them to write in their own voice to someone they know, so that all these issues of like your own voice, which will change based on who you decide to write to, right? And what you write to the person will depend a bit on your sense of what matters to them. And so really heightening all of that to remind people that actually even the most kind of academic kind of writing, those elements still have to be there. They may be tempered, they may have a different sound than it would in a letter to a friend, but they have to be there. And in fact, in the best kind of, you know, scholarly writing, it's always there. I mean, you know, scholars don't become well known simply because they have a good idea. They also often have a style. They also have a voice, you know. And it's very easy to fall in the trap of thinking that it's like a certain kind of like set of argumentative check boxes, and you know, and it's not. And so, and it's also a little bit of a product of how English is often taught in high schools, and trying to correct a little bit of that as well. So, so yeah, the way I teach writing is very connected to, I think, my sense of what are some of the pitfalls and the way you can lose yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have a similar set of priorities, I think. And the way that I often think about the sense of voice is I'm very committed to not having prompts for papers, and almost all of my classes are based on papers, and I always want to draw out from the student a process that they're going to undertake to give meaning to the material that we've worked with together in the class. And that means setting up the framework, raising the question, deciding what's interesting. And that, to me, is a way, and the language that I use for that is, it's a way of exercising interpretive judgment, deciding what things should count as. And I always want to push students to exercise their interpretive judgment, decide that something is a horror or hilarious or a provocation, and make a set of connections that are really embedded in the material that allow me to see just what they want to show me about what we've been doing together. And so in the context of the writing process, I always want to say, and I find myself often saying, that I don't want to fetishize the paper, right? I want to sort of naturalize it as a moment of communication between us, right? This is just another, we talk in class, hopefully, maybe you come to office hours. This is just another moment. Let's not make it into some specialized, right? This is another moment where we can have an interaction and show me something, show me something that only you can see, or even play with the idea that this is something you see, and wear that mask for a little bit and write from that posture. And so I find that trying to shift the writing process to one of that's part of the relationship and the communication that's ongoing is a way, hopefully, to free up some of the anxiety, to loosen it up, so that someone can write to me out of a real kind of invested engagement with the material. And I have to say, in responding to the papers then, I often want to do it kind of freely, and sometimes I worry about things coming off harshly, but my goal, and hopefully they don't, but my goal is always like, I want you to see me on the page responding, like, this is where you hit me with this sentence and I felt it, or I didn't like it, or I don't get it, or wow, I've read this thing 500 times and I've never had that thought. And and I'll tell my kids when I go home, I've read this thing 500 times, this student just did this thing with it and I can't even believe it, right? I love that, but I want the student to find that and get me there. And so whatever I can do to kind of loosen things up and naturalize that experience to help them do that, that's what I want to do.
Yeah. It's like writing is thinking, right? Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's like rather than as product. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
You both mentioned the idea of a voice and a writerly voice in your idea of your pedagogy around writing. If you could, and this is probably a difficult question to answer, would you mind describing your own voice in writing and perhaps where or how it developed over time?
I can go on this one first if you want.
Boy. Yeah, I mean, do you want to go?
No, I'm.
No, no, I don't. I mean, guys, that's a hard question, Reid. I would say I tend towards the. Well, okay. Writing, I can perform a lot of different styles. I can write in a lot of different ways, sometimes I can have fun sounding quite formal, quite scholastic, this or that. I feel most at home in a slightly informal, colloquial style that's conversational, that uses the first person and that asks questions and invites people to see themselves in certain kind of questions. It says, try this thought out, that kind of thing. I think I like that kind of semi-plain spoken. But at the same time, I also like philosophy, I like theory, so it's not always possible to be that, down to earth. But I think it's actually partly because that's the terrain in which I've worked a lot that I appreciate the ordinary, because I like to bring it a little bit down. I want to make it more accessible to people. I don't think philosophy needs to be as baroque as it often is, as opaque as it often is. Yeah, so I'll pause here. That's just really off the cuff. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, other people would be way better judges. Yeah.
And I think it's true that we have to, out of necessity, have different registers and different voices. I mean, there's a book review that I just wrote, and it's a lot more formal than I am in the book that I wrote. But I have to say, so in the book, I've used a lot of foul language from time to time. I feel like I'm a little meaner when I write than I am normally. I have to say, I think I am, and I don't know why, but or at least I get a little excited about the provocation sometimes, or really raising the level of the stakes with the emotion in the language. So I think that's there a little bit for me, but I also, I don't know, I like to shift around, and I'm thinking mostly, I'm not like some prolific writer, you have to understand, right? I've got and so it's not that I have so much to choose from, but I know that in the big project that I spent most of my time working on until this new project, there was really an attempt to shift around also in order to, I don't know, again, have that quality of the way a conversation shifts around. Like sometimes our mood changes, we get a little serious, then we get a little ridiculous, So, and in fact, somebody commenting on the book, when it was in manuscript, I think it was even one of because when at the press, they give it to blind readers, and then they write you back, and it's some expert, and they have all sorts of, and they can say whatever they want because you don't know who they are, and so they can be really, really harsh. And I remember one of the comments was, there's at least two different sort of registers in this book, and you need to choose one. And I said to the editor, I'm not going to. Probably because I don't know how. Like, I know I want to say this, and I want to say this, and either you're going to let me try to hold them together or not, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do it in one or the other. And luckily, they just let me do that. But I do think my voice in writing is this guy that you're hearing right now, which is either insufferable or incredibly interesting and entertaining. But it's pretty consistent across the writing for me. Even probably in a thing like a book review, frankly, I just can't help myself. Also, I always feel like there's got to be a little bit of an irritation, to make it interesting or create opportunities for some kind of energy that's going to be creative, just whatever that is. I probably am very much drawn to that in my writing style, I have to say.
Thank you so much. One last question, I think, before we shift to a Q&A session, and this will be a bit of a shift as well. So we've been talking a lot about writing in the classroom, or book-style writing, or academic writing in general. I was wondering if either of you have a sense of the role that writing plays in your non-academic and personal life. Some people will journal for 15 minutes before going to sleep. I'm sure there are listless ways of doing it.
Well, the students who've taken my classes know I send long emails, which are actually a crucial part of my teaching. I communicate a lot of both affect and content in my emails to students. Sometimes I think it becomes like really too much, and I apologize. Also, I have an Instagram page where I'm sharing stuff about meditation, and I actually put a lot of care into the captions. I'm such a boomer. I actually focus on the captions. My son is like, "No, Dad, you don't write captions that long." But the I think I'm using it like Facebook or something. But like the writing that I put there is actually that's me. And it matters a lot to me. And I'm actually thinking of, I'm writing a piece now for a Buddhist magazine called Tricycle on contemplative education, and thinking of like writing a book that's for the popular audience, that's based on the class I'm teaching now on meditation. So yeah, so it's playing a bigger and bigger role in my life, and it feels, there's a lot of energy there, so I like it.
Yeah, I think because I'm not on social media, and I find that it can be really an interesting medium for written expression, I gather. But I have not done it, and I'm just, and I really don't like to write emails. I have, so I don't know what's up with me there, but I know that I don't do it. And honestly, I think there's some kind of preciousness, which is maybe negative, which maybe I'm not happy with, about writing, where I don't like to be writing unless I feel like to myself, this is the writing, you know? And I can get a little bit resentful of whenever I'm in a position to even write the smallest thing that's not the writing in my mind, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know, that might not be very healthy, or I don't know what's up with that, but...
You shouldn't have said yes to sharing.
You
have to email a lot.
and it's true. Yeah. I mean, I mean, you have to, professionally, you have to write emails, you have to write reports, and I think I'm figuring out a way to do it, and I've been on committees where I've had to do that. And I have surprised myself, frankly, that I was even capable of it at all. I have to tell you, but it's hard for me. Like there's something. It's a little bit something where something sacred, frankly, feels like something. I don't know. There's something's happening too close to something that's supposed to be sacred that makes me feel uncomfortable, and that's probably silly and certainly not tenable in my professional life. But that is something that goes on for me. So there's either the writing, when I'm finally, like I'm putting the books aside, I'm just sitting there and I'm trying to craft it, or there's the not writing. And so I think actually I have a little bit of a, I don't know, I have some kind of resentment or something about that third space. So, but I don't know much about it. We'll have to keep.
Jeff, I have an idea. Okay, one thing I've done over the past few years is start to record audio responses to papers, and I just think like it would be amazing if you did that. I'm just like a student getting like a 20-25 minute like audio response from you about the paper. That would be like amazing.
I feel like that would be suffering for them. But interestingly, like writing on papers, even though it takes a long time, I actually don't mind that quite as much. Just because it feels conversational, frankly. It feels like I'm just, having an interaction, and it's not so, I don't know. Yeah. But I hear you, and I think...
I don't think it'd be suffering for them. I think it'd be fun, yeah.
But it's not a bad idea. And there is this technology now, right? I mean, and it's an interesting point about writing, where writing is not always sitting down and writing, right? There are ways in which what writing and speaking and things and recording, these things are all getting blurred now. Whatever that's worth.
Well, yeah, thank you so much again for all of your great answers. We're now going to open it up to any questions that the audience might have. I'm going to turn this around just in case.
Thank you all for coming. I know you guys are so busy right now. This is really nice to see you all.
So, something you both mentioned, and that I've been thinking about a lot, is writing is sort of this process of thinking. And that, for example, as you're writing a paper sometimes, and I found that with my best work, my argument changes and develop it, and I think about it as I'm writing this piece. But I see this a lot as a tutor in the writing center. I see it a lot with my own writing sometimes as well, where when I'm beginning to start an assignment, on the one hand, I want it all planned out because I'm scared to sort of get started unless I have a roadmap of where I'm going, and also because I'm worried that if I start drafting, I'm going to get lost in the drafting process. And, I have 4 classes. And so how would you encourage students, how do you motivate them to really, in some ways, take that risk of just plunging in with their ideas and letting writing be this thought process when they are also expected to produce a formal piece of writing for classes?
It's a really good question. I think that, in fact, Jeff and I were chatting a bit this afternoon in passing about the challenges of being a student here, or even being a professor here. I think there's just something very strange about time here. Time feels so scarce. It makes total sense that you feel this pressure to kind of, delineate tasks because you have to get them all done. And to be honest, I encourage my students to think on paper, to revise and all this stuff. But as a teacher here, knowing the pressures of this place, I also have to be realistic. And I also tell, not every paper has to be the perfect expression of what you want. It's not just a moment of communication, as Jeff was saying, but even a moment in the life of that paper, right? This doesn't have to be the final version of this paper. So it's an art of knowing how much to dig up so that you can, suture it together relatively quickly. This is not a non-utopian, non-idealistic answer. It's just, I think it's like real world. It's like, sometimes people know it's not going to work unless they do some radical revision, right? And then people just do that. And it's actually often quicker. Sometimes this is the issue, sometimes it actually slows you down trying to make fewer edits, because what you really need to do is tear it apart, right? And radically restructure, and then it'll just flow. And I think it's really having a conversation with a student where you kind of get that sense of, is this actually like a radical change that is going to actually make your life easier? Are you holding on for security but actually causing yourself more suffering in the long run? Or maybe, it doesn't have to be the perfect final version, but this gets you closer to where you want to go, and you have 3 other classes you need to work on. It's just that kind of careful, balancing, and it takes a certain kind of relationship with a student and their thinking to get to the point where you can give them useful advice. And also freedom, permission to not be perfect, which is probably just important in general, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really important to think in terms of trying to be realistic about when you need to sort of release something into the world. An editor once said to me about a piece of writing that I needed to do, first just write the rant. Just let it out. Whatever it is, this idea is just write the rant and then come back. But the whole rant, all the way from start to finish. And so one strategy, and I think this is there are lots of different ways to think about this, but one strategy, I think, is to free yourself to write the rant. Just write the undeveloped, formed thought come out, and then you have something to go back and edit, and then you can say, well, I seem to be very preoccupied with this, but what is the evidence for that, and where did I even get that idea, right? Well, but that's a great opportunity to go back to the text and be like, well, okay, it was here, here, and here. Well, and then now you're building the paper, right? So I think if you free yourself, it's often specific to the material and the kind of paper you're trying to do, but as one general response to what you're asking, I think one method is to try to write it through, the whole thing, irresponsibly, right? And then come back, and then see what's there and shape that, and that functions as your new outline. But really, it's material, and you're in a different position when you're shaping material than when you're trying to figure out what even goes on the page. And that can be a little bit freeing, I think.
Actually, I'll add on to that, because actually there's a technique I've used that's a little bit like this. So often I'll encourage students to free write before they start a paper to sort of generate ideas. But actually free writing at certain moments during the revision process can also be useful in just the way Jeff's talking about, where you know something matters, but you're not quite sure why you're having trouble piecing these two parts together. Something's stuck in the thinking. You realize maybe something needs to be changed. Instead of going in and messing with the actual text, free write freely about the ideas. And often there'll be some kind of sense that will emerge, oh, this is actually what I want to say. It'll be in a looser form, but then it gives you a sense of, okay, instead of just trying to puzzle parts that you've already written together in different ways, which can feel really awkward. And so, yeah, that's my version of the rant, you know. His is edgier, but yeah.
I think probably a lot of the writing tutors in this room, and presumably also your professors, will have this experience of like the student who says something to the effect of like, you know, I hate writing, I'm only taking this class because I need to graduate or whatever, something like that. And I was just wondering, like, how do you, with those students, how do you get them to, you know, like, or at least, you know, tolerate like the process of writing a paper?
I think it's going to be, so I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, you know, because the answer I would give is centers relationship, you know. So it actually it's not about getting them to love writing, it's getting them to want to engage me in thinking. And then the writing becomes a channel of that relationship. I think what's so hard is you have these one-off encounters with students, right? And I think there's probably just going to be, it's like imagine just, you know, calling Talkspace once, like for therapy, right? It's just only so much is going to happen in one session of therapy or something like that. So I think you just, it's for your own mental health, you'll probably want to have more modest, you know, expectations of what you can do. Because, you know, yeah, it's really like, I think everyone has a natural curiosity. Everyone has a desire to express themselves. Some things become damaged if they start sounding like that. No one just hates like language and writing and thinking. So it gets at like, how do you recover that kind of natural curiosity? But that takes time in so many conversations. So it's not an answer to your, I just want to give you honest like how I would do it, but it's really, it would take like many, many conversations and like, kind of like, you know, kind of encouraging them to come out of their shell. It has a lot to do with how I respond to the questions in discussion during class, you know, and really seeing like learning what interests them and maybe encouraging them to pursue those routes. Yeah, no, I know. I don't have a good answer for you. I just want to say like this is what has worked for me.
I really identify with what you're saying there, Bernie. Both elements really. The first, in sort of the way that I probably will want to express it to a student is just, you know, talk to me. You know, what do you want? Here we are. Talk to me. You know, what do you? Sometimes what I'll say is even, you know, something's probably got to infuriate you about something we're talking about in class, right? That really annoys you, or there's got to be something that I said. Like get that out. Enjoy that. You know. But let's have this relationship, you know, and that's a way of enjoying, identifying with, not being alienated from the writing process. Here's something I do have to say, you know, and I think it's related to this way in which I do have a certain kind of view that maybe we both got from John Dewey. I don't know. For me, it was. This expectation that people do, it's a philosophical anthropology. It's a view about people want to be engaged in non-alienated, expressive, communicative relationships that they are always already in. And they want to do that. And if they don't want to do it, something's gone wrong. They don't feel safe. Someone's told them that they shouldn't. Something's gone wrong. So that the idea is to somehow free up the space, even if it's in a negative way, to use that opportunity to be really, I don't know, to be an antagonist in a productive way. Whatever that's going to be, I hope that students will be like, the professor wants me to do that, wants me to use this writing opportunity to get into some kind of mode of flow with myself, you know, to engage them through the paper. And then that's when it becomes fun. That's when they forget about, do I like papers, do I not like papers? I'm just trying to say this to you, you know? I'm just trying to communicate this. So I don't know, hopefully, again, that's a general thought, and each different particular case is going to be different.
And what's hard about this strategy, I think for you guys, is you don't maybe not know the professor, right? And so that the student, to take this kind of opportunity, I think needs to trust that they can rant, they can, you know, just attack. And I think I would welcome that too, and I tell people that, but it takes some trust on the student's part, and so they might say, I'm just gonna play it safe. There's so much risk management, right, when it comes to this kind of stuff, yeah.
Well, and then also, I'll just say, add on to that, I think that's a great point, and that makes it partly our responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So partly, if a student's saying in a class, I just don't feel like I can write anything, partly that's our fault.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is our job to make it seem like, look, this is your chance to be you in language with this material, And so that really is partly on us, to make people feel like that sense of trust, where they can play around with versions of themselves and voices in a way that feels productive and exciting and not stifling and tortuous and so forth.
But if you do know the professor that student's writing for, and you know that person will be game, then say, I know this person. You just lay it all out there, Yeah. It's a hard one.
Yes. What classes are you guys doing in the fall? And will you please accept me as one of your students? I get a feeling that you're going to have a long wait list for students. And then a second question, Professor Bernie, you were speaking earlier about when you lost that sort of playfulness and started to become, your writing started to become a little bit more technical. How do you get that back? You spoke already on, handwriting it to somebody else as a way to make it a little bit more personal. What are some other ways that students can use without, let's say, going to
No,
the only one?
I think free writing is incredibly powerful. If you guys haven't read Natalie Goldberg's book, Writing Down the Bones, it has some basic instructions for free writing that I think are very, very powerful. It can unlock a lot. It's kind of amazing. Like, I teach a class on meditation regularly, but I actually think that the most powerful practice that students come out of it with is free writing. So that will loosen up almost anything that feels stiff and inauthentic in someone's relationship to language. And whenever I feel stuck, I free write. So actually it goes back to something that Reid was asking about earlier. Like, it's one way that I write regularly when I'm trying to get back in touch with my own voice and what matters to me. It's more than even voice. Because the problem is if you feel alienated from your writing, the truth is it's probably not just writing. That's the problem. Right? What is showing up in your relationship with writing is probably indicative of some broader thing that's awry with your life. It's like to your goals, your studies, your career path, something like this. And so it's not like some trick is going to fix the writing. Sometimes something about your life needs alteration. But free writing, I think, can help clarify what feels wrong and help loosen that up. So.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about stamina when working on long-term projects and building that, not falling into fatigue, whatever you want to do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I think the tricky thing about this is there's so many different life situations one can be in when you're trying to work on a writing project. When I was working on my PhD dissertation, I was living in Brooklyn, and I had a 1-year-old, and my wife was working full time, and it was just total chaos. And I was writing late at night, and that was one situation. And that required certain kinds of thinking about how to make that happen over years. Now I'm in a different situation, much, much better, I have to say. And I appreciate that, and I'm very grateful for it. But it still requires conscientious thinking about stamina and about the long term. And so my answer, though, to the question is, I really think for me anyway, it's important to have a kind of predictable writing schedule. And to make sure it's limited in such a way where you don't have this sense of, well, I gotta write as much as I can today, right? Because then you're gonna end up writing past the staleness point, and then it's just like, wait, what? Is that? And then you're going up and you're starting to change things that are perfectly fine, you know, and then you get exhausted and then you quit early. That is a mess. that you don't want to do, in my experience. Instead, if you say, look, I'm going to do, you know, during the semester, I'm going to try to do a few 3-hour blocks and really maximize them, right? And then once I've done, I'm done. Like I'm gonna read more, I'll do whatever, right? Have some conversations, but that's all I'm gonna ask of myself. Being realistic about what blocks you need and then limiting them in that way, I think is freeing. It makes the writing time more productive in its space. And there's only so much productive writing you can really do when you're trying to do creative thinking, I think. Now some people, like I've known people who can just go and go and go. My advisor in graduate school, she's just writing and then teaching classes and doing public things, and then you come into her office and if you leave to go to the bathroom, she's writing more, and you know, like she's just constantly, and she could just do it, you know? She's brilliant, right? That's not me. I need to have like some special time and then have it built in for a long period of time, and then also be realistic that that's just going to take a long time, and allow myself to experience it in those little increments rather than experience the whole thing every time. You know, I do this with reading also, I'll just say, because maybe it makes it clearer than what I just said. Like, I have lots of, for a research project, I have lots of things that I'm trying to read, and I always set it up with daily allotments for each text. So, you know, there are, say, 3 different things I'm reading now for my writing project, but I'll only read, you know, 20 pages of each per day. You see what I'm saying? And after I finish that 20 pages, I don't bother about, if I read more, I could finish this by, I did my 20 pages this book, I'm moving on to the other book, right? So that way I know that when I'm done with that allotment, I'm free, I'll do whatever, I walk the dog, hang out with the family, you know what I mean? But so that to me helps me get through. And when that's all set up in a really nice schedule, and it's all, there's nothing, it feels so good because you feel great about those moments. And when you look back after months, you're like, wow, look at all that happened. Because you don't realize that if you're consistent, even in small amounts, over a long period of time, you can do a lot, a hell of a lot. Like imagine if you just read 30 pages a day of something, think about how much you would have read in 30 days. A lot. You know? And that's just 30 pages. Right?
Even if you just wrote 1 page a day, right? You would have too many pages for your thesis, you know, by the time it's done. So actually, when you asked your question, I was like, actually, I remembered my experience of writing an English thesis, you know, at Berkeley, and it was the first time I'd experienced sustainable writing. Because I was the kind of person that if it was a 10 to 15 page paper the day before, you know, and, you know, I just would jam it out, and it would be pretty hellish for 24 to 36 hours, but I would do it. But when you got to the thesis, you can't do that, unfortunately. I would have tried. And so I actually did exactly what Jeff is saying. I wrote 1 page every morning. Sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. But I wrote that way for 2 or 3 months. And it was the most pleasurable experience of writing I have ever had. Alas, I think I haven't even had one like that since, but it was beautiful. And it showed me what a life that actually included writing in that way. It was amazing. And I had more pages than I could actually use, because literally, if you just write like a page a day, you know, it's like in 2 months, 3 months, you have like a 90-page thesis done. And then the rest of the day, you're reading a little bit, you're thinking, and then I would often make a point of stopping when I felt like I had a little bit more to say, so that the next morning I would already know how to start, you know, and just get going. So anyway.
And I'll add another little tip to that. With that kind of process, one of the things that I learned is not to go back Like if I was doing that, say 3-4 hour increment, or let's say you're doing a page, when you go the next day, don't go back and read that in order to correct it or just keep going. Just keep going. Come back, maybe decide that, in a month you'll maybe see where you are. But I do think it's important to hold off if you've in a long-term project, the going back, because you'll get stuck. And you'll overthink it. Just keep going, keep the argument going. And then when you've really got a critical mass, then go back and try to do the smoothing. I remember saying, a friend of mine, when I was at a point with my dissertation, when I was finally done, and a friend of mine was like, so how's it going? Where are you? And I was like, I'm in the smoothing stage. It's just smoothing, I'm trying to get everything, all of the weird things that don't make sense because I wrote this in 2008 and now it's 2011 or whatever. Like they have to, right? I'm gonna smooth it, but smoothing is, you can do smoothing. It's a lot easier when you've got this big thing that you've really done, I don't know if that's helpful. I hope that is.
Good luck.
So it's 8:35. This was scheduled to last until 8:30. I suppose we'll conclude here then, if no one has any further questions. Perfect. So before we disperse, I'd like to briefly. Oh yeah. Round of applause. Thank you again, Professor Israel.
It was a pleasure.
Rhie.
Yeah.
So before we disperse, briefly going to mention that we have 2 more events planned for the How I Write series. The next one will occur on November 11th with President Maud Mandel and Chief Communications Officer Jim Rhie. So that should be exciting.
Interesting.
And the final event is yet to be scheduled, but it will be more STEM-oriented. Okay. So please come back if you found this interesting. And once again, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Reid.
This is great.